Well, good afternoon. I'm Allison Payne, a professor in the Sociology and Criminal Justice Department. And I'm joined today by two graduate students, Ron and Katie, and an undergraduate, Michelle, all of whom will be presenting with me. And another undergraduate, Elizabeth, could not be here today due to a family event in Nigeria, but she actually helped with the research on this presentation. So today we'll be talking about various aspects of race and school disorder. And here's a brief outline of our presentation. We'll start by looking at various statistics regarding race and delinquency in today's schools, just to give us a picture of what's actually going on. Then we'll talk about racial differences in various school factors that are related to delinquency. And finally, we'll discuss some school-based prevention strategies that have been found to work in the reduction of delinquency and drug use. And specifically, we'll focus on programs that have been shown to be effective for multiple races and ethnicities. Okay. So first, what do the numbers show? Well, you can see the racial makeup of the schools in the United States, with about 60% of all students being white, non-Hispanic, and then approximately 20% each for Black and Hispanic, and the rest in American Indian or Asian. That just kind of gives you the picture of the racial makeup. Looking now at what the picture of school disorder looks like, this is from data during the 2005-2006 school year. Starting with the most serious, you can see that there were only 35 associated deaths that year. So school-associated deaths. So deaths in school, be it a teacher or a student or somebody else on the school grounds, is a very rare occurrence. Far more common, however, were non-fatal student victimizations. 1,496,300 students were victimized at school, which is about a rate of 57 students for every 1,000 students in school. And over half of these victimizations were violent or serious violent victimizations. This is compared with 1,241,000 student victimizations away from school, which gives us a rate of about 47 students per 1,000 students. So while schools are not incredibly dangerous, they are definitely not a safe haven. For years, many people thought schools were, well, at least get the kids in school, get them away from the violence on the streets. Well, that's not exactly the situation. Non-fatal teacher victimization is also common. A little under 7% of teachers were threatened with injury, while a little over 3% were actually attacked. And property victimization is even more common. You can see that drugs are also a problem. About a quarter of all high school students report that drugs are readily available at school, on the school property. However, you can also see that the actual drug use appears to occur away from school, because you only have about 4%, 4.5% using alcohol or marijuana on school property. Looking at fights and weapons, just under 15% of high school students were involved in a fight, and you can see that minority students are slightly more likely to engage in fighting than whites. You have about 33% of whites, 43% of blacks, 41% of Hispanics, 44% of American Indians. 6.5% of all students brought a weapon to school each month. And here, though, you can see that white students, black students, and Hispanic students all have roughly the same rate of weapon carrying. Okay, in terms of the overall school environment, just under 40% of middle and high school students report being the target of hate-related words or graffiti. And then you can see in the racial breakdown that while black students are more likely to be the victim of hate-related words, all students have similar rates for hate-related graffiti. And finally, not broken down by race, but you can see about 28% of students report being a victim of bullying. The last sort of number statistic I wanted to talk about is an interesting look at racial tension in school. A small percentage of students reported that racial tension does exist in the classroom, thereby impacting their educational environment. And you can see that greater racial tension exists in larger schools and schools with more minority students. So this is suggesting that there's perhaps a tipping point for tension, depending on the size and the racial composition of the student body. Okay, those are just some numbers to give you a picture. We're going to turn now to look at factors that are about the school that are somehow related to delinquency. In other words, there are certain factors that we know are related to delinquency, like academic performance or attachment to school, and we know that they're related to delinquency and drug use and school disorder. So the question here is, are there racial differences, if you could just go back for a second, Katie, are there racial differences in these relationships? That is, for example, is the relationship between school performance and delinquency stronger or weaker for black students as compared with white students? Or is the relationship equal? So we're first going to look at individual level factors like academic performance or attachment to school, and then we'll look at school level factors such as the racial composition of the school or the school's climate. And first I'll talk about the general relationship between each factor and delinquency. And then I'll look at what the research says about potential racial differences. And then we'll have a few studies presented in depth by Ron, Katie, and Michelle. Okay, so the first individual level factor we'll look at is academic performance. This is easy to understand. This refers to a student's educational successes and failures, basically how well a student is doing in school. As we would expect, consistent evidence supports the association between poor school performance and delinquency or drug use. That is, students who do poorly in school are more likely to be delinquent or use drugs. Moving on to studies that examine possible racial differences, we see that when we're looking at drug use, there are no racial or ethnic differences in this relationship between academic performance and drug use. Okay, so that means blacks and whites, it's an equal relationship. If you do poorly in school, you're more likely to be delinquent. But when we look at delinquency and academic performance, we see that this is actually a stronger relationship for white students. So in conclusion here, the possibility of racial differences in the relationship between academic performance and deviance depends on the type of deviance studied. There's no difference seen for drug use. So it's equal across races and ethnicities. So doing well in school protects all students equally from engaging in drug use. But it's different for delinquency. The relationship between academic performance and delinquency is stronger for whites than minorities. So while doing well in school protects all students from engaging in delinquency, it has a stronger protective effect for white students. Okay. Another individual level school factor that researchers have looked at is what is called attachment to school. This is shown by the extent to which students care about their school, care about their teachers, and the extent to which students care what their teachers think of them, if they care about their opinions. The more students feel like they belong in their school, the more they care what teachers think of them, the less likely they are to be delinquent. Because they don't want to mess it up. They don't want to disappoint their teachers. Or they don't want to disappoint their peers in their school. If they feel like they belong, they won't be delinquent. As with academic performance, this negative relationship that you see up here, higher school attachment leads to lower delinquency, is very supported by research. Looking at possible racial differences, again, we see no racial differences in the relationship between attachment and drug use. However, this time we're very unclear about possible relationships, possible racial differences in the relationship between attachment and delinquency. One study finds no differences, another study finds that it's stronger for non-whites, and a third study finds that it's stronger for whites. So again, in conclusion about attachment to school, the possibility of racial differences in the relationship between attachment and deviance again depends upon the type of deviance studied. There's no difference seen for drug use, and we see that in multiple studies. But the findings for delinquency are mixed, with one study finding each possibility. So we clearly need more research here before we can come to a conclusion. A final individual level factor that has been studied is commitment to school. This is the time and energy invested by students in the pursuit of educational goals. This has to do with how often you attend school, or the reverse, how often do you skip school. This has to do with how hard you work in your classes, how much time you put on your homework. The idea is students who invest a lot in their schooling by consistently attending school, by working hard on their homework, they don't want to jeopardize their investment by being delinquent. Because what would happen if you were delinquent? You might get kicked out of school. Versus kids who don't work hard at school, don't invest a lot, they have nothing to lose, right? Nothing stopping them from being delinquent. All right, as with attachment, the negative relationship between commitment and deviance is well documented. But again, looking at racial differences, we see very similar findings as before. No racial difference between commitment and drug use, but unclear about the relationship between commitment and delinquency. No difference, stronger for non-whites, stronger for whites. So once again, the possibility of racial differences in the relationship between school commitment and deviance depends upon the type of deviance studied. With no difference for drug use, so being committed to school, working hard on your schoolwork, consistently attending school, protects students from being involved in drug use. But we're for all students, all races. But we're not sure if there are racial differences with delinquency. Commitment to school protects all students, but we don't know if it protects different races differently, because again, we have one study showing each possibility. So again, we need more research. All right, now we're going to hear from Ron, Michelle, and Katie, who will present in-depth findings about specific articles that were just referenced.
As Dr. Payne just said, I'll be talking about the Rosé article from 2000. And the primary concern with this article dealt with racial and gender differences as predictors of delinquency and drug use. The reason for this article is due to previous research on risk and protective factors. Risk factors are things that will increase the probability of participation in delinquent behavior. This could be things like family criminal behavior, family conduct, academic failure, or low commitment attachment to schools. And then there's protective factors, which decrease the probability of participation in delinquent behavior. Now the concern here is because research has shown that protective factors may be gender and ethnic specific, so certain prevention services may be suited best for certain racial groups, and ultimately prevention services without regard to racial or gender may prove to be ineffective. So the purpose of the study, again, is to assess the reliability and the validity of predictors of delinquency across gender and ethnic groups. There were 3 total data sets for the study: the School Action Effectiveness Study, the National Education Longitudinal Study, and the Effect of School Battery. The total sample, as you can see, the blacks, there were 6,786 males and 7,214 females. The Hispanics had about half of that, with 3,661 males and 3,778 females. The whites had almost double the population of blacks, with 12,561 males and 12,563 females. Asians came in with 873 males and 831 females. And then others, which would include ethnicities such as American Indians, came with 1,378 males and 1,290 females. The study used 3 different measures on drug use, delinquency, and risk and protective factors. Drug use looked at both drug use for the entire life course and drug use within the previous 12 months. Delinquency was measured in serious delinquency and things that they called rebellious behavior. And the risk and protective factors that were used were done in 7 measures, such as positive peer influence, parental supervision, parental attachment, commitment to school, attachment to school, academic failure, and beliefs in pro-social norms. In terms of findings, in delinquency, overall it was found that all risk and protective factors tended to be more valid predictors of delinquency for whites than minorities. Whites had the strongest relationships for attachment and commitment to schools, and of the minorities, blacks showed the weakest relationships for commitment to school. And this was especially seen when examining the relationship between commitment and rebellious behavior. In terms of drug use, differences for drug use were extremely rare, but overall all risk and protective factors tended to be equal across all the groups. But negative relationships with academic performance, attachment to school, and commitment to school were seen for all the different racial groups. It should be a note, however, that although small differences were seen across the different gender and ethnic groups, they were seen as rather trivial, and all risk and protective factors were still seen as significant predictors of drug use and delinquency.
Cernovich and Giordano were two professors at Bowling Green State University, both of the sociology department. Cernovich's research talked about the chronic juvenile offenders and conceptualization, and spoke about the overrepresentations of minorities in the justice system. Giordano spoke of, her research studied the role of peer relations and the etiology of adolescent problem behaviors, and she studied the role of the family and peer processes. These two worked together to describe the manner in which school bonding affected the delinquent conduct. They focused on how the role of the school affected the delinquents' involvement, especially in the black youth, since they were the overrepresented in the justice system. So these two did a research with 942 students ranging from the ages of 12 through 19. 51% of the students that were being researched were female, and 50% of them were black, 45% white, 5% is the other. And these were all done in urban schools because research found that the urban schools had the most delinquency problems. Within their research, they found a relationship between the attachments to the school and delinquency, but they said that there was no difference between the racial composition, that the blacks were as strongly as bonded to the schools as the whites were, because that their model explains the comparable amounts of variance in delinquency and conditioning the effect of school bonding on delinquency. The research also found that the commitment to the school does not vary across racial or gender groups because both groups were both committed to the schools. They worked on the extracurricular activities. They spoke to their teachers the same. That's not the problem. One of the limits that they put on after finding that the control theory was actually right was saying the fact that it's not only the bonds within the school, maybe they need to look at the youth family and their peer bonding, because those are another type of bonding that could affect their delinquent acts. So their findings supported the control theory, which was a model that purports that the invariant across race, gender, and socio-economic boundaries. So they found this research. They said that there was no difference between the two bondings between the racial groups, and they're still doing research to find out what is the major problem.
Okay, the article that I'm going to talk about deals with school environment, self-esteem, and subsequent delinquency. Now you have to remember that since the 1954 decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, public schools, the racial environment, has been steadily changing. So this has led researchers to question whether the racial environment has affected the learning environment. So this article in particular set out to question whether self-esteem, race esteem, school commitment, and delinquency ultimately differed by the racial composition of the school environment. Now, according to self-esteem, it's a kind of difficult concept to define because it's so large, but Ross actually defined it as self-concepts that are representative of people's perceptions, memories, and experiences, and how these are meaningful to the individual. Now, there are currently two competing hypotheses of how self-esteem is affected for African Americans due to a racial composition of a school. There is the contact hypothesis, which says that the segregation of African American children based purely upon their race results in feelings of inferiority regarding their status within the community. So this would mean that attending a predominantly white school would enhance an African American student's self-esteem. The other hypothesis is the insulation hypothesis, and this claims that increased contact with majority students, mostly Caucasians, would ultimately lower an African American student's self-esteem. Now, the insulation hypothesis has been largely supported by empirical evidence. So this does suggest that African Americans in segregated schools would actually enjoy higher levels of self-esteem than their more integrated peers. Now, research has also uncovered a correlation between self-esteem and academic performance. However, this has largely been seen among cases of low self-esteem, such that low self-esteem is correlated with low academic performance. Now, in interracial comparisons, it has been shown that African American students suffer lower levels of self-esteem as compared to their Caucasian peers when both of them are from similar social backgrounds. It also has been shown that Caucasians consistently outscore African American students on measures of academic performance, thus leading some research to question this correlation. Now finally, this leads to ultimately questioning whether race, self-esteem, and delinquency are somehow correlated. However, studies have often found contradictory findings. Some studies find that there are no significant differences among race and self-esteem. However, they do find that African Americans score slightly higher on delinquency levels as compared to their Caucasian peers. Other studies find that blacks show a propensity for delinquency while exhibiting high self-esteem. So these numerous studies, while they do find contradictory findings, few of them have ever actually been examined within a school environment. So Ross actually does take these questions within the school environment. So he gave out self-reported questionnaires consisting of 103 items. He gave them to approximately 1,100 students randomly in 3 Midwestern high schools. He had a completion rate of about 79%, so that's about 870 students. And this is how it broke down. 160 black males, 250 black females, 156 white males, and approximately 190 white males. Now the remaining 12% was about 113 students, and they were Asians, Native Americans, and Hispanics, and Ross actually didn't include them in his hypotheses. He mainly wanted to focus on blacks and whites. He investigated 4 variables: self-esteem, which is measured using the Janus Field self-esteem scale, and these had questions like, how often do you feel there is nothing you can do well? Race esteem, he defined as having a high regard for one's racial reference group or a sense of pride in being a member of one's racial group. These questions such as, I am proud in every aspect to be a member of my racial group, or I must admit sometimes I wish I were a different color. He also measured school commitment, and these were questions such as, what grades do you receive mostly in school? How important is it for you to do well? How much time do you spend on your homework? Finally, the 4th measurement was delinquency. And these were self-reports of the number of times that students had committed delinquent acts within the previous 12 months. Finally, his independent variable was the school environment. And like I said, there were 3 high schools that he used, and these were broken down upon racial composition. One school was mostly black. This was 90% of the population had to be African American. The second one was mostly white. 65% had to be white. And finally, it was a mixed school that were neither blacks nor whites, made up more than 50% of the population. So finally, upon his results, he found that all 4 of his measures were actually significant. Self-esteem, he found, was significantly higher in the mostly black school environment as compared to the white or equally mixed schools. And this is consistent with previous findings that African Americans in a mostly black school environment enjoy significantly higher levels of self-esteem. It's also support for the insulation hypothesis. He also found that self-esteem within the mostly white school environment was actually lower, thus suggesting that the insulation hypothesis is more applicable to the mostly black school environments. As far as race esteem goes, he found that it was significantly higher within the mostly black schools, as was school commitment actually. School commitment had no noticeable significant differences for the mostly white or for the mixed schools. Finally, for delinquency, he found that there were slightly higher rates in the equally mixed school environments, meaning that neither the white or the mostly black schools had higher levels of delinquency. As for the prevalence of delinquency, his analysis showed that the proportion of delinquency was actually similar for both black and white males, but not according to females.
Okay, so now we switch a little bit. The series of factors we just talked about were individual level factors. That is, in a school, how does my attachment to school differ from Michelle's, differ from yours, etc.? How does my academic performance differ? How does your commitment to school differ? Now the next group we're gonna talk about are school level factors. That is, comparing one school to another. And these are various school level factors related to delinquency. There are 2 main categories of school level factors. The first are school contextual factors or school structural factors. These refer to predetermined characteristics of a school over which the school has little or no control. So it's kind of what is brought into the school by the students and the teachers who are there. In general, some structural characteristics do predict school disorder. Things like student-teacher ratio. If there's a higher ratio between students and teachers, then you're more likely to have higher levels of disorder. Percentages of male students. If there are more male students in the school, no offense, but it's likely to have more delinquency. School level socioeconomic status, school size. Larger schools tend to have more delinquency. There are far fewer studies on possible racial differences as compared to the individual level factors. But the few studies that are out there, again, most contextual factors see no racial differences. So student body factors like the age of the student body, the gender makeup of the student body, the faculty racial composition, the size of the school. None of these have racial differences in the relationship between those factors and delinquency. But the percent of black students in a school does, number one, increase the potential of violence in the school, which is an article that Ron will be talking about. But it also displays some interesting racial differences in its effect on delinquency. And this kind of jumps off of what Katie was just talking about. Black students engage in less delinquency and drug use when they attend a school with a greater percentage of black students. Okay? So for a black student, attending a school with more black students is a protective effect. It protects them from being delinquent and drug using. On the flip side, white students engage in more drug use when they are in a school with a greater percentage of black students. So for white students, attending a school with more black students is a risk factor. So it's the opposite. Now, both of these are very small differences mathematically if you actually look at the numbers, but it's an interesting difference nonetheless. Finally, in terms of contextual factors, socioeconomic status impacts minority students differently than white students, and that's an article that Katie will go in depth about. But the final conclusion about all of this, which I guess is not on the slide, is just that we need a lot more research when it's okay. Okay. It's not on there. That we need a lot more research when it comes to school level factors, as you'll also see when we do school climate. There's just not a lot out there about possible racial differences. Once again, I'm going to turn this over to Ron and Katie.
The article I'm focusing on this time is a 2003 article from Idle and Idle, and it's about segregation and school violence. The majority of research into desegregation focuses on academic performance. Research by Ballantine in 2001 showed over 100 studies done on academic performance. So it's surprising then that there's a lack of attention on desegregation and school violence. As Idle and Idle point out, the established tradition in sociological thought is that social and economic inequality has criminogenic consequences for minority groups. So what Idle and Idle did was focus on the impact of desegregation on school crime and violence. A little background to their hypothesis: they looked at studies on residential segregation patterns and community crime, and they found evidence that there exists some sort of relationship between racial segregation and increased crime rates. So what they did was take that to the school level, and since school is a complete social environment, they hypothesized that greater desegregation in school system, coupled with greater group inequality, would lead to greater rates of school violence. The data for the study was obtained from the Florida Department of Education and then the Bureau of the Census. There were 740 schools total in 40 different counties, and this consisted of 317 high schools and 423 middle schools. The measures that they used were school violence, and this was measured in homicides, rapes, robberies, assaults, fights, and forms of harassment. And they also looked at different school characteristics. These are things like culture, which are the values, norms, the attitudes, and the clarity of rules within the school. The organizational structure, which was measured in the average class size and the number of students. They looked at the percentage of African American students who were in the school, and they had an index of dissimilarity, which is the proportion of all students, both black and white, who had to be transferred in order for the percentages of black students to be equivalent to the amount of black students in that entire district. And they also had an index of racial inequality, which looked at different racial groups and the residential patterns, income, employment, and education. When it comes to the predictors of violent crime, it showed that the percentage of black students, school culture, and school code were all significant predictors of crime. Higher percentages of black students, middle schools as opposed to high schools, and schools with weak attachment and commitment of the student body to the school have higher violent crime rates. It was also found that higher levels of crime in the community were associated with higher levels of crime and violence at schools in those communities. And the highest violent crime rates came from schools where students lived in racially stratified communities but attended integrated schools. So again, it kind of goes back to what Dr. Payne was saying about the percentage of black students. If they go to school with other black students, it might have lower levels of crime, but since they're integrated with white students and they're still somewhat in the minority, they have higher violent crime rates in their schools.
Okay, the article that I focused on questioned whether family socioeconomic resources could actually account for racial and ethnic test score gaps. And it was by Duncan and Magnuson in 2005. Now, ultimately, a little background concept that you have to know first is that they used a data set, which is the nation's most comprehensive assessment of school readiness, and it's called the Early Childhood Longitudinal Study. And the authors actually used the 1998 version. And what was found was that black and Hispanic children score approximately 10 points lower than whites in math scores and 7 to 8 points lower than whites in reading scores. Now, the authors wanted to understand this phenomenon by investigating whether the different SES circumstances of white, black, and Hispanic families could account for the racial and ethnic gaps found in both test scores and in school readiness among these children. Now, the ECLSK shows that racial gaps in a family's SES status closely match the gaps in subsequent children's test scores. The average SES level for both black and Hispanic children is vastly below that of their white peers. Now, the authors do go into depth about 3 factors that need to be understood before they actually investigated SES and school readiness/achievement. So the first factor they looked at was marital hardship and subsequent household resources. Now, the ECLSK uncovered that the following factors were typical conditions for a poor child. The mother was often a high school dropout. It was often a single-parent family. The mother had no job or a job with little prestige. It was often an unsafe family environment. Now, these conditions were fairly common indicators for a family with inadequate economic and social resources. Furthermore, there are characteristics such as a large family size, residential instability, harsh discipline, few learning materials, low birth weight, young parents. These were all resource-related disadvantages that poor families with children often face. Now, in many cases, these differences were often amplified as much as 2 to 3 times for poor children as compared to their more wealthy peers. It's also most important to note that the majority of these hardships were not only dictated by poverty status, but also by race and ethnicity, with blacks and Hispanics much more likely to experience such an environment. In fact, the majority of black and Hispanic children were suffer at least one of these hardships, compared with just over half of their white counterparts. Now, experiencing 4 or more of these hardships was very rare for white children. However, it's much more common among Hispanics and even more so among African American children. Now, the second element that they looked at was household income. Now, for years, many people have claimed that higher family incomes would be correlated with a positive academic achievement. And this makes sense in the fact that one would think financial resources would allow parents to provide good prenatal health care, a rich learning environment, and good schooling. However, the causal nature, whether or not income actually leads directly to academic achievement, is controversial and it's debated. In fact, one experiment that was conducted looked at welfare programs from the early 1990s, and these welfare programs increased employment. However, only in the cases where income was increased did the children in preschool and elementary school actually have increased academic achievement. So this does suggest that income is related to a child's academic achievement. However, the exact specifics are still unknown. Now, the third factor that they looked at was family structure, because currently it's known that approximately 1/3 of all children are born outside of marriage, and half of all children will grow up in a single-parent household at one point throughout their childhood. So this statistic is of great concern when you're studying SES, because single-parent families will experience a scarcity of resources. because young children living with single mothers will face poverty at 5 times the rate of their peers who live in intact homes. Ultimately, financial and time restraints limit a parent's ability to provide a supporting home environment for their children. And it's also important to note that family structure differences, this growing up in a single family, does vary across racial groups. Only 15% of white children will grow up with a single parent household, 24% for Hispanics, and nearly 50% of all African American children will grow up with a single parent, most likely a mother. Now, on average, children raised by single parents do have lower social and academic well-being. They're also at greater risk for poor achievement and behavioral problems. And again, it's interesting to note that this is majority of Hispanics and African American children. Now, in closing, ultimately both theory and evidence do suggest that family SES environments in which children are raised in may account for at least some of their differences in school entry readiness and achievement. And most notably, these effects are negative for minority students. But furthermore, the question does remain, though, how exactly SES contributes to school readiness, to school achievement, and ultimately these standardized testing gaps that we have. On average, though, it has been found that both Black and Hispanic children enter into school lagging behind in their academic skills as compared to their white counterparts. But understanding all the previous theories and all the previous concepts that we've talked about, it has been found that a handful of differences among a child's background do actually contribute to this gap in the math and the reading skills. And these include the SES composite, the number of children's books in a home, age of entry of kindergarten, birth weight, and age of the mother at time of birth. So ultimately, it has been found that SES is a factor affecting children, and also these SES circumstances tend to fall along racial lines.
Okay, so the last group of factors we'll talk about before we move to prevention are what are called school climate factors. These are still school level factors, but rather than the contextual factors that can be sort of thought of as your more tangible, more measurable factors, these are the inner workings of the school, the social organization, the cultural system of goals and norms, the management of school discipline. In general, schools with positive climates have lower levels of school disorder. And what do we mean by positive climates? Well, we can see this through concepts such as communal school organization, which is the existence of supportive relationships, collaboration, common norms and goals. We all sort of agree on the direction of the school. Positive climates also include positive discipline management, which refers to how the students perceive the rules and the rule enforcement. If students think rules are fair, if they think that they're clear and that they're fairly enforced, this indicates a more positive school climate. Very, very little research has looked at racial differences in the effect of school climate on delinquency. But one study did find that communal school organization was significantly related to delinquency, but there were no racial differences. So being in a school that's organized as a community, as a supportive community, was equally protective for all races. Positive discipline management was also significantly related to delinquency, but here we see a stronger relationship for non-whites. So in conclusion here, having a positive school climate with a supportive community, common goals and norms, clear rules, fair rule enforcement protects all students from engaging in delinquency. And it's possible that the supportive community, the communal school organization, has an equal effect, while having the clear and fair rules has a stronger effect for minority students, but ultimately there's just not enough research to make a firm conclusion. So we're turning now to school-based prevention strategies. And the question is, what works? What type of prevention strategies work in schools to reduce delinquency and drug use? At the school level programs, 2 types work. Building school capacity to run itself effectively. This has to do with changing the decision-making processes, changing the authority structures to generally to enhance the capacity of the school. Often you see teams of people, teams of teachers, other staff, parents, students, the community, engaged in planning and carrying out improvement activities in the school. The second type is clarifying and communicating norms about behavior. Norms are general expectations for behavior. This is appropriate in school, this is not. So this kind of program are school-wide efforts to Define norms for behavior to signal what is appropriate. So here you're talking about establishing clear rules, improving the rule enforcement, communicating the norms through school-wide campaigns like newsletters and posters. Okay. At the individual level, two types of programs work. Social competency skills instruction. This is what most people are familiar with when you talk about school-based delinquency. These are curriculum-based programs, so a teacher is teaching them. And it includes life skills training, such as teaching kids how to problem solve, teaching kids decision-making skills, how to make the best choice, anxiety management and anger management and stress management skills. They tend to use what are called cognitive behavioral delivery methods, far more interactive. So rather than doing what we're doing right now and someone stands up and lectures at you and you fade out and you don't really listen, instead it's a far more interactive way of teaching and communicating skills where I get up and model a skill, then I pull you up and you up to practice the skill, and then I give you feedback and we rehearse and we practice it in all kinds of different situations. So it's a lot less lecture and individual seat work and more interactive and cooperative learning. The fourth type of program that works are behavior modification and cognitive skills programs. It's the same, it's similar as what I just described, but there's not a major curriculum and it's not taught to all students. It's a smaller group of more at-risk students. Behavior modification focuses directly on changing the undesired behavior by rewarding desired behavior and punishing undesired behavior. Cognitive skills programs, cognitive skills means thinking skills. These programs teach problem-solving skills, decision-making skills. This is based on research that indicates that delinquents are deficient in these thinking skills necessary for social life. They don't think before they act. They don't realize the consequences of their actions. They don't sit there and say, all right, here's my problem, what are the possible solutions, what are the consequences of each solution, and which is the best one to do. So these programs, as you'll see in a minute, teach us how to do that. But the final question for this presentation is, what works for everyone? There are programs in here that have been, specific programs in these types, that have been shown to work, but maybe only in a small Midwestern town where it was 99.9% white students. Well, great, but that's not applicable then to an urban school where you have 50% Hispanic. So what we're going to do right now is look at 4 programs that have been shown to work in all different types of samples. Your Midwestern, your Native American, urban, African American, whatever. Okay, go ahead. Thank you. Here's an example of the type of program that builds the school's capacity to run itself. It's a program called PATH, Positive Action Through Holistic Education, which we implemented down in Charleston, South Carolina. It's based on this team structure. School teams use structured planning methods to develop a general improvement plan for each school. And the activities that they chose targeted the entire school population. School-wide climate and academic innovations, policy review and revision, looking back at the rules and saying, should we change these to make them clearer, to make them more fair? Professional development for the teachers, how can they better teach? Okay, so as I said, Charleston, South Carolina, 7 high school and middle schools got the program. 1 high school and 1 middle school did not. They're called comparison schools to do research. When the research was done, students in PATH schools reported less delinquency and drug use, fewer school punishments, meaning suspensions, detentions, expulsions, and higher levels of attachment and belonging, going back to a risk factor we already talked about. In addition, the overall climate in PATH schools improved. The teachers had higher morale. The students reported that rules were clearer and more fairly enforced. Both the teachers and the students said that administrators were more effective. So the overall climate improved. So this is and again, Charleston, South Carolina is a very racially mixed school district. So we're seeing this working in a mixed sample. The next program that we're talking about is an example of this clarifying and communicating norms for behavior. It's called Ulvaeus's Bullying Prevention Program, and this was developed in Norway. Yes, terribly heterogeneous, right? In the late 1980s. And the point of this program is to alter the norms in the school regarding bullying. We're redefining bullying as wrong. The point of this program is bullying is not accepted in our classroom, in our school, and we will see that it comes to an end. And there are a whole variety of activities. Booklets are sent to the school to spell out ways to counteract the bullying. Advice booklets are sent to parents, videos, there are posters, there are clear class rules about bullying, reward systems, praise and sanctions related to bullying, improved supervision on the playground, teacher involvement in developing a better climate. And in the original study in Norway, 2,500 students in 42 schools got the program, and bullying decreased by 50%. In addition, they saw smaller effects on other types of delinquency like truancy, vandalism, and theft. So why am I talking about Norway? Well, because this program has been replicated in many countries, including the United States, including Philadelphia. Lots of different samples, and it's a fabulous, fabulous program, and I guess we're moving on to the next one, so, which is fine. Okay, this one is an example of the social competency skills instruction program. It's called Weisberg's Social Competency Promotion, and it's aimed at general social competence that we talked about, these problem-solving skills, decision-making skills. It teaches these students how to do it, and what happens is a teacher teaches them using those interactive methods. But it's all based on this stoplight. When you have a problem, stop, calm down, and think before you do anything. Say the problem and how you feel, set a positive goal, think of lots of solutions. Think ahead to the consequences of those solutions and try the best plan. So I, as the teacher, to model this, would get up and say, all right, here's my problem. I was driving to work today and I stopped at a stoplight and the person behind me rear-ended me. So I stopped, and I said the problem and how I felt. Well, you know how I felt? I was pretty freaking pissed off, right? I set a positive goal. Well, I'd like to come out with the best solution here. I'd like my car to be fixed. I'd like to not be late to work. I think of lots of solutions. I could get out of the car and go and punch the person that hit me. I could sit in my car and cry, or I could get out of the car, exchange insurance information with the person that hit me. Think of the consequences of each of those solutions. If I get out of the car and punch the person, I'm going to be late to work, my car won't be fixed, and I might get arrested on assault charges. If I sit in my car and cry, I'll be late to work, my makeup will run, and my car will not be fixed. If I get out of the car and exchange insurance information, I'll be late to work, but my car will be fixed, my makeup will still look good, and I won't get arrested on assault charges. Aha! That's the best solution. Let me go ahead and try this. So the teacher models that kind of thing. We get up, we role play, we practice this, generating alternate solutions. If someone insults you in class, maybe the best solution is not to punch him. What are some other solutions, etc. There are 16 to 29 sessions in this program, and it depending on which one you buy, which one the school buys, and it happens in a normal classroom. Everyone gets it. The original study was tested on 421 middle school students, 5th through 8th graders, in 11 program classes with 9 control classes, and these were in 4 urban multi-ethnic schools. And program students, so students who had the Weisberg program, showed improvements in impulse control, so this ability to restrain the impulse to hit someone or to do whatever, call someone names, problem solving, academic motivation, and teasing. Their actual delinquency remained stable, but the control kids who didn't get the program increased. So that's great, because at least the program students didn't increase along with the control students. And then also we've seen replications in more inner cities and suburban schools all over the place that support this program. Finally, an example of a behavior modification strategy is a program called the Good Behavior Game. This is for 1st and 2nd graders, and this is the idea of changing behavior by rewarding desired behavior and punishing undesired behavior. Again, this happens in the classroom to try and improve aggressive and disruptive behavior in the classroom. It's led by the teachers, and the teacher assigns students to various teams. And they try to balance the teams for both gender reasons and behavior reasons. So you're trying not to have one team with all the good kids and one team with all the bad kids. You try and mix them up. then the teacher defines and posts the undesirable behaviors. In this classroom, there will be no talking unless your hand is raised. You will keep your hands to yourself and not take other people's things, etc., etc. Clear rules, right? And what they do is they play these sessions throughout the game days. So we're going to play the good behavior game for 20 minutes. And what that means is teams are rewarded when no member of the team exhibits these bad behaviors during the game sessions. Rewards are tangible at first. These prizes, they start as like stickers or, you know, bucks to the school store, whatever. And then it moves to less tangible praises. Hey, you did a great job. Or extra time in the reading circle. Because you don't want it always to be this kind of tangible, materialistic desire. And the frequency and length of the game sessions increases. The program lasts for 2 years, so it increases over the first and second grade years. The original study was in 5 urban areas where socioeconomic status ranged from very poor to middle class, and there were 3 public elementary schools in each area, one of which would get the program, and 2 schools would be control schools. And there were 2 cohorts of first graders. So one year there were first graders, they moved up to second, and there was another year of first to second, with a total of 1,604 students. Again, positive results. These students showed less aggressive behavior both at the end of your first year in the program and then at the end of grade 6. So you're talking 4 or 5 years later. In addition, the boys in the program were less likely to begin smoking, although the girls did not show this positive result. So those are 4 examples of programs that work in multi-ethnic samples. Just 2 broad overall conclusions. Despite the differences that some articles showed, most school-related factors impact all students equally. Even when racial differences are seen, they are small in size. In addition, as we've just seen, there are prevention programs that work to reduce delinquency and drug use for all students and all schools. And so we should be implementing these programs that we know work, as opposed to, you know, maybe wasting money on programs that we know don't. Thank you. If there are any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, thank you. Okay.